The sky above the colony world was bright with two suns, their light falling over the green fields and silver towers of the settlement. Families walked together, children ran along the wide streets, and traders unloaded goods from small starships. It looked peaceful, almost like a dream made real. Humanity had traveled far to build this life among the stars. For a time, it seemed nothing could take it away. Captain Laura Mitchell stood at the edge of the landing platform, her dark hair tied back as she looked over the colony below. She had served in the fleet for years, guiding trade convoys and exploring new systems. This assignment felt easy compared to the battles her parents once told her about on Earth. She wanted it to stay this way. Behind her, Commander Ethan Brooks checked the status of their transport ship. He was tall, with sharp eyes and a quiet voice that hid his steady determination. Dr. Daniel Carter was nearby, walking through the crowds with a data pad in his hand. He was not a soldier but a researcher, fascinated by alien plants and cultures. He had come to this colony to study local life forms, but he also liked talking to settlers. He saw hope in them, a belief that humanity's future was safe. The colony's central plaza was alive with voices. A market stretched from one side to the other, filled with spices, metals, and strange tools traded from alien allies. For years, humanity had been building trust with these other civilizations. They believed peace was possible, that the wars of the past would not return. The settlers wanted to believe in something brighter. Then the sky burned. At first, people thought it was only a meteor shower. Streaks of fire lit the heavens, growing brighter and louder. But the light was not falling rocks. It was ships, dark, spiked ships cutting through the sky. Alarms screamed through the colony as defense systems tried to activate. Before anyone could run, the first explosion struck the outskirts of the settlement. Towers collapsed. Streets broke apart. Fire spread faster than anyone could react. Laura froze for only a second before snapping into command. She shouted to the settlers, telling them to move toward the evacuation shuttles. Ethan grabbed a comm device and ordered the fleet officers to prepare for takeoff. Daniel rushed into the crowd, helping a family that had fallen as people pushed and screamed. The attackers were the Veer. Few humans had ever seen them, but their reputation was known. They were a fierce species, their ships built like blades, their weapons leaving nothing but ash. Until that day, no one believed the Veer would dare strike a human colony. Now it was clear that the rumors of their hunger for war were true. The colony defenders fired their cannons, but the Veer ships were too fast. Fire rained down again, tearing through homes and schools. Families tried to run but found the streets blocked by falling debris. Laura took command of a squad of soldiers moving through the chaos. She pulled a child from the wreckage of a broken transport, pressing the girl into her mother's arms. Her voice stayed calm even as fire and smoke filled the air. Ethan guided people to the landing platforms. His sister had been on another colony far from here, but her face flashed in his mind as he watched families break apart. He forced himself not to think about his own fear. He had to keep moving. He had to keep helping. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and more lives would be lost. Daniel Carter was not trained for battle, but he refused to stand aside. He entered a burning building when he heard cries for help. Smoke choked the air and the heat was fierce, but he found two children trapped inside. He led them out just before the roof collapsed. Their father, his face streaked with ash, thanked him with shaking hands. Daniel wanted to say something kind, but words failed him. The sky kept burning. The evacuation shuttles began lifting off one after another, their engines glowing as they carried settlers toward the fleet in orbit. But the Veer saw them. Their ships turned, their weapons targeting the small shuttles. Laura cursed under her breath and gave an order. She directed her own vessel to dive in between, taking the fire meant for civilians. The ship shook violently, alarms flashing, but it survived long enough for the shuttles to escape. The screams in the comm channel haunted Ethan. He heard families crying, children calling for parents, officers reporting they were overwhelmed. Still, he shouted back, keeping their voices steady, reminding them they were not alone. He could not save everyone, but he could not let despair win either. The battle lasted less than an hour. When it ended, the colony was gone. The silver towers were reduced to ash, the green fields blackened with fire. Thousands had died. Thousands more had escaped, but their homes were lost forever. The Veer ships vanished into the void, leaving nothing but smoke behind. On the fleet's flagship, Laura stood silent before a viewing screen. She looked at the burned colony below, her fists tight at her sides. For years she had believed in peace. Now she knew peace was fragile, weaker than the fire of war. Ethan stood beside her, his face hard. He had seen many things in his career, but this cut deeper than all of them. He thought of his sister again and wondered if she was safe on her own colony. The fear in his chest grew heavier. Daniel sat alone in the medical bay, his hands shaking. He had saved some lives, but the faces of those he could not save returned again and again. He thought of the Veer and wondered why they had done this. What had humanity done to deserve such fury? He tried to imagine a reason, but no answer came. Only silence and smoke. The fleet carried the survivors back toward Earth. On the journey, people whispered stories of what they had lost. Some spoke of vengeance. Others prayed for protection. Children clung to their parents, afraid of the dark beyond the stars. The memory of fire would not fade. Laura listened to the voices of the survivors. She did not speak, but she promised herself one thing. Humanity would not fall. They would rise no matter the cost. The Veer thought they could break them with fire. They were wrong. Humanity had faced storms and wars before, and they would endure again. The first seeds of rage had been planted. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. A line had been crossed. Something had been taken that could never be given back. And though the colony burned, the spirit of its people did not. They carried it with them, back to Earth where decisions would soon be made. The stars outside looked calm again, but to those who had seen the fire, they no longer felt safe. They no longer looked like places of wonder. Instead, they looked like battlefields waiting for the next spark. And in the silence of space, humanity began to change. They were no longer just explorers, no longer just dreamers. They were something else now, something the Veer would soon learn to fear. The colony world was gone, but the memory of its fire stayed with everyone who had survived. On the journey back to Earth, silence filled the ships. People sat together in quiet corners, whispering to each other, holding their children or staring at the walls as if they could still see the flames. Every person carried the same question. Why had the Veer attacked? Why had they destroyed families and homes without warning? Captain Laura Mitchell stood in the command deck of her ship. She had been through battles before, but this one was different. She could not shake the screams she had heard over the comms, the sight of towers falling, the sound of children crying for parents who would never return. Her hands rested on the railing as she looked at the stars. They had always seemed beautiful to her. Now they felt darker, like silent witnesses to something cruel. Commander Ethan Brooks had not slept since the attack. His mind would not rest. He kept seeing his sister's face, though she was far away on another colony. He had not heard from her yet. Every moment of silence made him fear the worst. He remembered the faces of the families he had guided to the shuttles, the way they had looked at him as if he was their only hope. Some had made it, others had not. His calm voice had helped them then, but now he felt heavy, his chest tight with grief and anger. Dr. Daniel Carter sat in the medical bay helping care for survivors. He was no doctor, but he offered what comfort he could. He listened to stories, wrote down names of the missing, and promised children that their loved ones would never be forgotten. He tried to smile, but it never reached his eyes. He was a man who studied life, who believed in learning from other cultures. Now he was forced to face death and destruction. It unsettled him more than he could say. When the fleet reached Earth, the survivors were welcomed, but the mood in the great cities was grim. People watched the news broadcasts in shock. Images of burning towers, broken ships, and crying children spread across every screen. The world that had once celebrated peace among the stars now felt fear and sorrow. Crowds filled the plazas, holding candles for those who had been lost. But under the sorrow, something else was building. Rage. The leaders of Earth gathered in the Great Hall, a wide chamber filled with representatives from every nation. They spoke of the attack, of the lives destroyed, of the future at risk. Some argued for caution, saying they needed answers before action. Others shouted that answers did not matter. The Veer had already shown their intent. They had chosen fire. Humanity could not stay silent. Laura was called to speak before them. She stood tall, her voice steady. She told them what she had seen, what she had felt as the colony burned. She spoke of the courage of the settlers, of the soldiers who gave their lives to protect the shuttles, of the families who had lost everything. She did not cry, though her throat was tight. Instead, she let her anger sharpen her words. Humanity, she said, could not allow this crime to pass. If they did nothing, more colonies would burn. Ethan was there as well. When it was his turn, he did not speak like an officer. He spoke like a brother. He told them about his sister, about his fear that she might be the next victim. He told them how it felt to see families torn apart, to know that the Veer had no mercy. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of every survivor's grief. By the end, the hall was silent. Daniel also spoke, though his voice was softer. He reminded them that the Veer had made their choice. They had not declared war. They had not offered words. They had only brought fire. He had studied the Veer, had read the little that was known about them. They valued power above all, crushing anything they feared or hated. To them, humanity was just another rising star to extinguish. There could be no peace until that threat was ended. The leaders debated for days, but the decision became clear. Humanity would fight back. They could not wait for the next attack. They had to prepare, to unite, to build ships that would stand against the Veer. Earth's nations, once divided by politics and pride, came together under one purpose: survival. Factories that once built trade ships now built warships. Engines roared in assembly lines, metals were forged into armor, weapons were designed stronger than ever before. Scientists worked day and night to improve shields and engines. Soldiers trained harder. Pilots prepared for battles none had imagined facing only months before. Humanity was changing, faster than anyone expected. Laura took command of a new fleet. The ships were still small in number, but each was stronger, designed with lessons learned from the attack. She drilled her officers day and night, making sure no mistake would cost lives again. She carried the faces of the lost in her memory, letting them guide her. She promised herself she would not let their deaths be for nothing. Ethan grew colder, harder. He still cared for his people, but the fire inside him was stronger than his patience. He drove himself to exhaustion, training soldiers until they could fight without fear. He no longer smiled, no longer joked. His friends worried about him, but he brushed them off. All he could think about was making sure humanity would never be weak again. Daniel worked in the science wing, studying everything known about the Veer. He searched their history, their biology, their culture. What he found was troubling. The Veer believed in domination through fear. They did not fight to defend themselves. They fought to destroy, to erase, to leave nothing behind. To them, mercy was weakness and peace was impossible. Daniel shared his findings with Laura and Ethan, knowing that understanding the enemy was the only way to defeat them. Meanwhile, the Veer did not stop. Reports came in from distant systems. More colonies burned. More ships vanished. The Council of Alien Civilizations spoke many words, but none offered true help. They feared the Veer, just as humanity had once feared the darkness of space. They sent condolences, not soldiers. Humanity stood alone, but standing alone was something Earth had always done well. They had faced storms, wars, and disasters before. Each time they had risen stronger. This time would be no different. As more colonies were attacked, more people volunteered to fight. Men and women left their homes to join the fleet, not out of duty alone, but out of fury and love for those they had lost. One night, Laura walked through the training fields where new soldiers marched under the pale moonlight. She listened to their chants, their boots striking the ground. She saw the fire in their eyes. These were not just soldiers. They were mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters. They were humanity's answer to fire. She felt both pride and sorrow. War would take many of them, but without them, humanity would fall. Ethan watched from the shadows, his jaw tight. He felt the same pride, but also the same sorrow. He knew some of them would not return. He thought of his sister again, wondering if he would ever see her. He let the pain fuel his determination. If he could not protect her directly, he would protect humanity itself. Daniel, in his quiet way, kept searching for a reason, a weakness, something that could explain why the Veer had chosen this war. But each answer only made the truth clearer. They had attacked because they could. They had attacked because they wanted to crush humanity before it grew stronger. And now they had awakened something they could not control. The fire the Veer had brought to human worlds had not destroyed them. It had forged them. The grief of the settlers, the rage of the soldiers, the determination of the leaders, all of it came together like metal in a forge. Humanity was no longer only building for peace. They were preparing for war. When the first new fleet lifted into the sky, millions watched from Earth. The ships gleamed in the sunlight, their engines roaring as they rose above the blue oceans and green lands. For the first time since the attack, people cheered. It was not the cheer of joy, but the cheer of defiance. The Veer had lit their worlds on fire. Now Earth was ready to answer. Laura stood at the bridge of her ship, her eyes fixed on the stars. Ethan stood beside her, his voice steady as he gave the orders. Daniel remained in the science wing, his mind turning toward the battles to come. Together, they carried the weight of humanity's future. The Veer had chosen fire. Humanity would show them what fire truly meant. The first fleets of Earth rose into the stars with a purpose no one had ever seen before. They were not built for trade, not built for exploration, but for war. Steel and fire formed their cores, and determination filled the hearts of their crews. Humanity had suffered, and now it was time to answer. The Veer had taken lives, destroyed homes, and burned colonies. Humanity would not forget. Captain Laura Mitchell stood on the bridge of her ship, the flagship of the fleet. The air hummed with the sound of engines and the soft voices of officers at their stations. Her hands rested on the railing as she looked at the stars ahead. She did not see them as places of peace anymore. They were battlefields, waiting for the clash of ships and fire. She had trained her officers well, and she trusted them. She knew that what they were about to do would change everything. Commander Ethan Brooks stood by her side. His uniform was sharp, his posture firm, but his eyes carried a storm within. He had once been calm and gentle, but now the fire of loss burned inside him. His sister was still missing, her colony out of contact. He did not speak of her often, but every action he took was for her. He wanted to make sure no more brothers or sisters would feel the same pain. Dr. Daniel Carter was not on the bridge. He sat in the research wing, his desk covered with notes and star maps. He was searching, always searching for some deeper understanding of the Veer. Their biology, their language, their culture, anything that could give humanity an advantage. He had discovered pieces of their war doctrine, their belief that fire and destruction made them strong. He knew this truth. The Veer would never stop until humanity was erased. And so humanity had no choice but to fight. The fleet's first mission was not an attack on a homeworld, not yet. It was to strike at a supply base in Veer territory. Intelligence showed that the Veer were using an asteroid belt as a staging ground, building weapons and ships. If humanity could strike there, they would prove they were not prey. They would show they could bleed their enemy. The journey through space was tense. Every officer, every soldier knew that they might not return. Yet none of them turned back. They had seen the faces of the survivors. They had seen the flames. They carried those memories with them like armor. When the fleet reached the edge of the asteroid belt, silence fell over the ships. The Veer base came into view, a web of spiked metal structures clinging to the rocks. Ships drifted around it like predators. Their dark hulls gleamed, their weapons ready. The sight of them sent a shiver through the crews, but Laura's voice cut through the silence. She ordered the attack. The first human warships surged forward, their engines flaring bright. Cannons opened fire, streaks of light cutting through the darkness. Explosions lit the asteroids, breaking rocks into fragments that spun into the void. The Veer ships moved quickly, their spiked forms rushing into the fight. Fire met fire, steel clashed with steel. The void filled with destruction. Laura kept her voice calm as she gave orders. She directed the fleet like a conductor guiding music. Ethan commanded a task force of smaller ships, weaving between asteroids, striking at the enemy's flanks. His voice was sharp, steady, giving courage to those under his command. Daniel watched the battle from his station, recording everything. He wanted to learn, to understand how the Veer fought so that the next battle could be won even faster. The fight was brutal. Human ships took heavy fire, their hulls shaking under the force of explosions. Some were torn apart, their crews lost to the void, but others held, their shields glowing, their weapons striking back with precision. Ethan led his ships into a daring maneuver, slipping between two massive asteroids to cut off a group of Veer cruisers. His boldness turned the tide, allowing the human fleet to surround the enemy. For the first time, the Veer ships began to fall back. Their confidence wavered. They had expected another easy slaughter, another colony to burn. But instead, they faced a fleet that fought with fury, a fleet that refused to break. One by one, their ships exploded, their fragments joining the asteroid field. Laura gave the final order. The human fleet targeted the Veer base itself. Missiles streaked across the void, striking the spiked structures. Fire bloomed in every direction. The base crumbled, its weapons silenced, its ships destroyed. When the last explosion faded, silence returned. The battle was over. Humanity had won. The crews cheered, but their cheers were not joyful. They were fierce, filled with defiance. They had shown the galaxy that they could fight back. They had proven they would not bow. But they also knew this was only the beginning. The Veer would not forgive such a defeat. They would strike harder, burn brighter. The war had only just begun. After the battle, Laura walked the decks of her ship. She spoke to the crew, thanked them for their courage, and reminded them of the lives they had saved. She did not hide the truth. Some of their comrades had been lost and their names would be honored. But their sacrifice had given humanity hope. That hope was stronger than any weapon. Ethan stood in the observation room looking out at the stars. His hands were tight behind his back. He thought of his sister again, wondering if she had seen the news of the victory, if she was still alive to hear it. He made himself a silent promise. He would not stop until humanity was safe, until no one had to live in fear again. Daniel studied the wreckage they had recovered. Pieces of Veer ships, fragments of weapons, shards of metal. He examined them carefully, searching for weaknesses, for secrets that could help in the future. His mind was sharp, but his heart was heavy. He had hoped once that understanding the Veer would lead to peace. Now he understood it would only lead to war. Word of the victory spread across Earth and the colonies. People who had once felt helpless now felt strength. They saw that the Veer could be defeated, that humanity was not doomed. Crowds filled the streets, not in sorrow but in determination. Factories worked harder, fleets grew larger, and soldiers trained with fiercer resolve. Humanity had struck back, and the fire inside them only grew. The Veer, however, were not silent. Reports soon came of new fleets gathering, of colonies burning even brighter. They were furious, and they wanted revenge. The galaxy watched in silence, afraid to intervene. Some whispered that humanity had made a mistake, that striking back would only bring greater destruction. But humanity did not care. They had been attacked first. They had lost too much already. There was no turning back. Laura, Ethan, and Daniel gathered in the war room of the flagship. Maps of stars spread before them, red lines showing enemy movements, blue lines showing human fleets. The air was heavy with tension. They spoke of new strategies, new missions. Laura's voice was steady as she said what they all knew. This war would decide the future of humanity. They would either rise or be erased. Ethan placed his hand on the table, his voice firm. He said humanity had already shown what they could do. They had already proven they could fight. Now they had to go further. They had to strike at the heart of the Veer, not just their bases but their worlds. Only then would the enemy truly understand what it meant to challenge Earth. Daniel did not argue. His eyes were tired, but his words carried truth. He said the Veer did not believe in peace. They only understood strength. If humanity showed weakness, they would be crushed. If they showed strength, they might finally be feared. And fear, Daniel said quietly, might be the only shield humanity had. The meeting ended with silence, each of them carrying the weight of what was to come. Outside the windows, the stars looked calm, but to them, each light was a battlefield waiting to happen. Humanity had taken its first step into the fire. The next steps would be even harder. In the days that followed, more fleets were built, more soldiers trained, more strategies planned. The galaxy still doubted, but Earth did not. Humanity had changed. They were no longer just explorers or dreamers. They were fighters. They had tasted fire, and they had survived. And as the new fleets rose into the stars, every man and woman aboard carried the same thought. The Veer had started this war, but humanity would decide how it ended. The victory at the asteroid belt gave humanity hope, but it also brought a shadow. The Veer were furious. Their fleets gathered in greater numbers, and their attacks on distant colonies became even more violent. Reports came daily of new worlds burning. Humanity had struck back, but the war was only growing larger, spreading like a fire across the stars. Captain Laura Mitchell knew that the fleet had to move fast. Waiting meant giving the Veer time to grow stronger. She stood on the bridge of her flagship, staring at the star maps that showed enemy movements. Every red marker was another reminder of the lives being lost. Her officers worked tirelessly around her, but she could see the exhaustion in their eyes. No one had expected the war to spread so quickly. No one had expected it to be this brutal. Commander Ethan Brooks trained soldiers day and night. He was relentless, pushing them harder than anyone else dared. Some whispered that he was too strict, but no one could deny the results. His soldiers became sharp, disciplined, and fearless. Ethan had no time for weakness, not anymore. He had seen too many families destroyed, too many homes lost. He carried the memory of his missing sister in his heart, and it drove him like fire. Every soldier he trained he imagined as someone who could protect her, someone who could keep another family safe. Dr. Daniel Carter continued his research, though the weight on his shoulders grew heavier. He had once studied life and culture with joy, but now his work was dark. He read records of Vaer war campaigns, stories of entire civilizations erased. He pieced together fragments of their history. The Vaer did not fight because they needed resources. They fought because they feared rivals. Any species that grew too fast, any people who became too strong, they destroyed before the threat could rise. Humanity had been seen as a danger, and so the Vaer had chosen fire. This truth hardened Daniel's resolve. There would be no peace. Not with them. The fleet prepared for its next mission. It was not enough to defend colonies anymore. They had to strike deeper, to make the Vaer feel the same fear they had forced on humanity. Intelligence revealed a major Vaer colony world near the edge of their territory. It was not their home world, but it was a stronghold, filled with shipyards and weapons. If humanity could destroy it, the message would echo across the stars. The journey there was long, and the silence of space weighed on the crews. Soldiers wrote letters to families they might never see again. Pilots checked their ships over and over, knowing a single failure could mean death. Laura walked the halls speaking to her people, reminding them why they fought. She did not lie to them. She told them some of them would die, but that their sacrifice would protect millions. Her honesty gave them strength. They trusted her, not because she promised safety, but because she promised purpose. When they arrived, the Vaer world came into view. It was dark, covered with jagged towers and endless factories. Shipyards circled it like rings, building new warships every day. The sight made Laura's heart tighten. This was no peaceful colony. It was a machine of war. She gave the order to begin the attack. The battle erupted instantly. Human ships surged forward, firing missiles and plasma beams. The Vaer responded with brutal speed, their black cruisers swarming like predators. Explosions filled the void, lighting the darkness with deadly fire. Asteroids shattered under stray shots, and wreckage drifted in every direction. The sound of alarms and shouting voices filled every human ship. Ethan led the ground assault. His forces landed on the planet's surface under heavy fire. The air was thick with smoke, and the sky glowed red from the burning factories. Vaer soldiers rushed to meet them, their armor sharp and their weapons deadly. Ethan moved at the front, shouting orders, pulling his soldiers forward even when the fire grew too heavy. He fought with fury, striking down enemies with the strength of a man who had lost too much to fear. The battle on the ground was brutal. Streets turned into rivers of fire, and buildings collapsed under bombardment. Human soldiers pressed forward, using cover, fighting as one. Ethan saw many fall, but he pushed the survivors on. He told them to remember their homes, their families, their lost loved ones. His voice kept them moving even when their bodies were ready to break. In orbit, Laura directed the fleet with cold precision. Every ship moved under her command, weaving between enemy fire, striking back with deadly accuracy. She had no time for hesitation. Every mistake meant lives lost. She listened to her officers, adjusted strategies, and pressed the attack. The Vaer fought like demons, but humanity fought like survivors. They refused to yield. Daniel remained in the research wing, analyzing the data streaming in from the battlefield. He watched how the Vaer moved, how they responded, how they retreated and attacked. His notes were frantic, his eyes burning with focus. He began to see patterns, weaknesses in their doctrine. They relied too much on intimidation, too much on overwhelming fire. When faced with an enemy that refused to break, they grew reckless. He shared his findings with Laura, giving her the tools to push harder. After hours of battle, the tide began to turn. Human ships broke through the shipyards, destroying half-finished cruisers before they could launch. On the ground, Ethan's forces captured the main control towers, planting explosives that ripped through the Vaer defenses. Fire spread across the world, but this time it was not humanity's homes that burned. It was the enemy's. The Vaer screamed in rage over the comm channels, but Laura did not flinch. She gave the final order. The fleet fired together, a storm of weapons striking the planet. Towers crumbled, factories exploded, shipyards collapsed into flaming wreckage. The Vare colony was broken, shattered in a single night of fury. When the smoke cleared, silence filled the stars again. Humanity had done the unthinkable. They had not just defended themselves. They had burned a Vare world. The crews of the ships looked at one another in silence, their hearts heavy with both triumph and grief. They had won, but the cost was great. Many soldiers would not return. Many ships were gone. But the victory was real. On the ground, Ethan stood among the ruins, his armor scorched, his voice hoarse. His soldiers gathered around him, exhausted but alive. He told them they had done what no one thought possible. They had broken the enemy. They had shown the Vare that humanity would never bow. His words were sharp, but his eyes were tired. He knew that more battles would come. He knew that this was only the beginning. Laura returned to her quarters after the battle. She sat alone, staring at her hands. She had given the orders that destroyed a world. She told herself it had been necessary, that it was the only way to protect her people. But part of her wondered how many more worlds would have to burn before the war ended. She whispered to herself that humanity would endure, that the sacrifices would not be in vain. Still, her heart felt heavy. Daniel looked at the reports of the destruction. He knew what they had done was terrible, but he also knew it was survival. The Vare had started this war because they feared humanity's growth. Now they had something real to fear. Daniel wrote his final note of the day. The Vare believe in fire, but they do not understand endurance. Humanity does. That is why humanity will win. The news of the victory spread quickly. Across Earth and the colonies, people cheered and wept. They saw images of the destroyed Vare world and felt a fierce pride. For the first time, the galaxy trembled. Other alien civilizations who had watched from the sidelines now looked at humanity with new eyes. They had thought Earth would fall. Instead, Earth was rising. But in the silence of space, the Vare were not finished. Their fury grew even darker, their hunger for destruction even greater. They had lost a world, and they would not forgive. They gathered their fleets, vowing to erase humanity completely. The war was far from over. Humanity knew this too. They had won a great victory, but they could not stop. They would have to fight again, harder than before. The breaking of worlds had begun, and there was no turning back. The war had raged across countless star systems, leaving burned colonies and shattered fleets behind. Humanity had learned the cost of survival, and it had grown stronger because of it. Captain Laura Mitchell stood on the bridge of her flagship, staring at the stars that now looked more like a battlefield than a home. She could see the Vare homeworld in the distance, dark and ominous, its spiked towers cutting into the sky like claws. This was the final step. The world that had started the war would meet its end. Commander Ethan Brooks stood beside her. His eyes were hard, his jaw tight. He had seen too much death, too much destruction. He had lost friends, seen colonies burned, watched families torn apart. Every loss had fueled his determination. He no longer fought for victory alone. He fought for humanity itself, for every soul the Vare had threatened. He knew that today, they would finish what they had started. Dr. Daniel Carter worked in the science wing, surrounded by star maps, data, and recordings from previous battles. He had spent months studying the Vare, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their doctrines. He knew what the enemy would do when humanity arrived. He shared his findings with Laura and Ethan, offering advice on the safest routes, the strongest strikes, and the critical points to target. The Vare believed in overwhelming power, but Daniel had found gaps in their strategy. Humanity would exploit them. The fleet moved into position surrounding the Vare homeworld. Ships of every size, armed to the teeth, formed a ring of fire around the planet. Pilots checked their systems one last time. Soldiers prepared their weapons, knowing this battle would be the fiercest of all. Civilians watched from distant stations, their faces full of hope and fear. This was it. The final strike. Laura gave the order to attack. The fleet surged forward, plasma beams streaking across space, missiles following in deadly arcs. Vare ships scrambled to defend their homeworld, but they were no match for the coordinated human attack. The human fleet moved with precision, each strike calculated, each movement synchronized. The Vare fought fiercely, but they could not overcome the determination and unity of humanity. Ethan led the ground assault on the Vare homeworld. His forces landed in the main city, moving quickly to take control of the critical points. The air was filled with smoke and the sky burned with explosions from orbit. Vare soldiers rushed to meet them, But Ethan and his team pressed forward, striking with speed and force. Every step they took brought humanity closer to ending the threat. The battle was intense. Streets were torn apart, buildings collapsed, and fire spread across the Vare cities. Human soldiers moved with purpose, never stopping, never retreating. Ethan shouted orders, rallying his men and women, keeping their focus on the mission. They could not afford mistakes. The Vare had been ruthless for years, and now humanity would repay them in strength. In orbit, Laura directed the fleet, coordinating attacks on the remaining Vare ships and installations. The data from Daniel allowed her to exploit weaknesses, targeting power cores and command structures. One by one, Vare cruisers exploded, their fire swallowed by the human barrage. The skies of the Vare world became a storm of destruction, a mirror of the chaos they had once inflicted on human colonies. Daniel watched every moment, recording the events, calculating outcomes, and advising Laura. He saw patterns in the Vare response, predicted their moves, and offered solutions. His work was critical, guiding humanity to strike the enemy with maximum efficiency. He knew the science of war was as important as courage. Together, strategy and bravery formed a force unstoppable. The fighting reached the central command towers. Ethan's forces breached the defenses, planting explosives that would dismantle the Vare control system. The explosions ripped through the towers, sending shockwaves across the city. Communication lines were destroyed, and the Vare soldiers became disorganized. Their homeworld was falling apart. Laura gave the final order for the decisive strike. All remaining human firepower focused on the heart of the Vare planet, their central power core and command hub. Missiles, plasma beams, and energy pulses converged, striking with unrelenting force. The ground shook, buildings collapsed, and a massive explosion engulfed the city. The Vare homeworld erupted in fire, its spiked towers crumbling, its fleets destroyed. Silence followed. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the human fleet regrouped, scanning for any surviving threats. None remained. The Vare civilization had been erased. Humanity had taken the fire that was brought to their worlds and returned it tenfold. On the ground, Ethan stood among his soldiers, exhausted but alive. They had fought bravely, and the cost had been great. Many of their comrades had fallen, but they had completed their mission. The enemy was no more. Ethan looked at the destroyed city, feeling a mix of triumph and sorrow. He knew the Vare would never rise again, but the memories of their war would stay with humanity forever. Laura returned to her quarters, standing by the viewport, looking at the stars. She had given the order that ended a civilization. She told herself it was necessary, that it was the only way to protect humanity. She thought of all the colonies that had been saved, all the lives that were spared because of this victory. Her heart was heavy with the weight of command, but her mind was clear. Humanity had survived. Daniel documented every detail, recording the final moments of the battle. He wrote of the tactics, the movements, the strategies that led to victory. He noted the bravery of the soldiers, the precision of the fleet, and the unity of humanity. He understood that this moment would be studied for generations. Humanity had proven that when pushed to the edge, they could rise, endure, and triumph. Across Earth and the colonies, news spread quickly. People cheered and wept. They saw the images of the destroyed Vare world and felt pride and relief. Humanity had survived the greatest threat it had ever faced. They had endured fire and emerged stronger, proving to the galaxy that they were not to be underestimated. The leaders of Earth spoke of rebuilding, of honoring those lost, and of preparing for the future. They knew that humanity could never be fully safe while dangers existed in the stars, but they also knew that they had proven their strength. The Vare would not return, and humanity had learned the true meaning of unity and perseverance. Laura, Ethan, and Daniel met in the command center one last time before returning home. They looked at each other, their faces showing exhaustion, relief, and pride. They had done what was thought impossible. They had faced fire and they had survived. They had erased the threat, and in doing so they had lit a new hope for humanity. The fleet returned to Earth carrying survivors, heroes, and the memory of the war. The planet welcomed them with open arms. People crowded the streets celebrating their return and honoring the sacrifices made. Humanity had fought against fire and destruction and had emerged victorious. As Laura looked at the faces of her people, she understood that humanity was forever changed. They had faced a ruthless enemy and they had won. They had seen the cost of war, but they had also seen the strength within themselves. And in the quiet of space among the stars that had witnessed both suffering and victory, humanity finally knew this truth. When threatened, they would endure. When challenged, they would rise. When betrayed, they would return the fire and ensure that no one would ever doubt them again.